And so we enter the strange world of nuclear strategy. Bernard Brodie, one of the most piercing strategists of nuclear weapons, had noted very early on, after the first bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that national objectives cannot be consonant with national suicide. We cannot set ourselves as a government or as a state objectives to be attained that might result in the destruction of that very state. Now, to the bleakest conclusion that would say that it is therefore impossible to think strategically anymore, or to conceive of war at all, we have the retort of strategists such as Colin Gray, who, while acknowledging that the tactical use of nuclear weapons is dubious, we can still think of nuclear weapons as weapons, and that we can still think strategically. If by strategy we understand not merely the use of force for the political purposes, but also the threat of the use of force. And indeed, this is central to nuclear strategy as it developed in the Cold War. It would revolve primarily around the threat of the use of force as a means to avoid its use. This idea is encapsulated by the key notion of deterrence. What is deterrence? Well, we could define it as those actions that are taken to dissuade a potential adversary from initiating an attack or conflict by either threatening retaliation or denying them any confidence of attaining their objectives. So deterrence is the use of a threat to convince an adversary that the course of action it might want to take is against its own interest. In other words, that the costs involved in attack would be too great, that these very costs would outweigh any potential gains. And in the nuclear context, of course, deterrence was central because these weapons were then wielded in such a way that governments threaten one another with their use so as to persuade the other not to use them. This, of course, means that in order to conduct nuclear deterrence, you must not only possess nuclear weapons, but you must continually be signaling an unflinching readiness to use them. If you can't convince your adversary that you will use them, then they will not deter. So it is with this central paradoxical premise, the premise that the purpose of the accumulation of military force is its non-use, that we enter the strange hyper-rationalist world of Cold War nuclear strategy. A world characterized by the rise of defense intellectuals, people such as the aforementioned Bernard Brodie, but also William Kaufman or Herman Kahn. Individuals who were new figures in the military community because they were not men who had risen through the ranks, who had direct experience of war. They were intellectual figures who applied rationality, scientific method to the use or to the development of nuclear strategy and claimed this approach to be superior to anything which their military counterparts could propose. Herman Kahn famously asked a general who was skeptical of his approach how many thermonuclear wars he had recently fought. The answer, of course, is none, because no one has fought a thermonuclear war. And that was Kahn's point. We have no experience we can draw on. This nuclear world is completely different from the one that preceded it. Experience from conventional military conflicts is no guidance to it, not least because we don't want to fight nuclear wars. We want to find ways not to fight them. Now, the way in which deterrence was deployed originally by the US was as a response to Soviet superiority in conventional forces in Western Europe. So the Americans relied on their nuclear capability, which at that point was much greater than the Soviet capability, and they used it as a deterrent to the Soviet Union. Because they knew they couldn't compete on the ground with conventional forces, they explained, this is largely under the Eisenhower administration, they explained to the Soviets that, and signaled to the Soviets, that if the Soviet Union was to invade Europe, then the United States would proceed with a mass bombing of its cities with nuclear weapons, effectively annihilating the Soviet Union. Now, this original threat of massive retaliation became increasingly problematic as Soviet nuclear stocks grew, because it dawned on nuclear strategists that this nuclear deterrent, this threat of a retaliation in nuclear weapons if the Soviet Union was to take offensive action, might fail if it became possible for the enemy to launch a first preemptive strike. So if the Soviet Union, in a bolt out of the blue, used its nuclear arsenal to destroy the American nuclear arsenal, and could ensure that it did so to a sufficient degree that any response from the United States would now be a very weak one, that the Soviet Union could survive, then there would be no deterrent. Worse than that, the Soviets might be incentivized to do such a thing if they believed they could get away with it. If they saw a window of opportunity, a moment in which a surprise attack would deliver a decisive outcome, then rationally it might be the course they would choose to follow. Accordingly, nuclear strategists decided that it would be necessary for the United States to possess a second strike capability. A second strike capability means the ability to withstand a first strike from the enemy and still retaliate with enough force to destroy the other society. This, they believe, will sustain deterrence. If the Soviet Union could have no confidence of degrading American nuclear deterrence or nuclear capabilities sufficiently, then deterrence would hold. In order to achieve this second strike capability, this meant a vast increase in the number of weapons, far more than would be required to destroy the Soviet Union in a first strike, but also a range of defensive measures, the protection of launch sites, the development of early warning systems, of various air defenses that would reduce the effectiveness of a Soviet strike. It also meant such measures as the development of a permanent airborne capability, so keeping nuclear bombers in the air constantly so that they couldn't be destroyed on the ground in a surprise attack. And eventually the development of nuclear submarines, which remain to this day a critical aspect of nuclear deterrence, because submarines obviously can conceal themselves, are very difficult to detect and to destroy. They can surface at a moment's notice, including very close to the enemy's coastlines. And so they are a very cost-effective way to acquire and maintain a second strike capability. Now, of course, this search for a second strike is mirrored by the other side. The Soviet Union also pursued a second strike capability. And the nuclear strategists concluded that so long as both sides had their military capabilities, their second strike capabilities, then there would be a balance of terror. There would be what they refer to as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Both states would be confident that they could destroy the other in a second strike, and so there would be no rational incentive for either state to initiate conflict. Conceptually, really this amounts to each country permanently holding the other's population hostage. As the American nuclear strategist Thomas Schelling put it, the balance of terror is simply a massive and modern version of an ancient institution, the exchange of hostages. In older times, one committed himself to a promise by delivering his hostages physically into the hands of his distrustful partner. Today's military technology makes it possible to have the lives of a potential enemy's women and children within one's grasp, while he keeps those women and children thousands of miles away. As long as each side has the manifest power to destroy a nation and its population in response to an attack by the other, the balance of terror amounts to a tacit understanding backed by a total exchange of all conceivable hostages. To sum all this up, I encourage you to pause the video now and to watch the accompanying brief clip from a 1958 US Air Force film called The Power of Decision. It's a nice summation of the strategy of deterrence and mutually assured destruction. Now, by 1960, the US deterrence policy relied on a plan for war entitled the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. And this plan in 1960 entailed the delivery of 3,000 nuclear weapons to around 1,000 targets in the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe. The estimated fatalities of this plan was found to be 285 million. I've noted already the very paradoxical nature of nuclear strategy. States acquire and accumulate weapons that cannot be used for any rational end, and yet it's precisely so that they are not used that they are accumulated. All the preparations have to be made for their use in order to ensure that they're not used. If deterrence is not taken seriously, if the preparation for war is not credible, then the enemy may well be tempted to gamble on a failure or nerve, on the fact that when push comes to shove, you won't push the button. You won't kill tens, maybe hundreds of millions. And so, the prevention of war becomes the preeminent objective of military preparation. As Bernard Brodie had observed in 1946, thus far the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. This explains why Strategic Air Command is the branch of the US military that during the Cold War was responsible for the nuclear war plans and would have carried them out. Its motto was, "Peace is our profession," although it's noted that insiders often appended, "and war is our hobby." Driven by the fear that the other side might acquire first strike capability and initiate a surprise attack. This is an important point. The balance of terror was delicate because it was deeply unstable. As each side increasingly acquired more weapons, it risked outpacing the other and developing a first strike capability. That is to say, the ability to take out the enemy's own weapons and leave it with a very weak retaliation. So this reciprocal fear meant that weapons were stockpiled, with recurrent concerns over a so-called bomber gap, a fear that one side was acquiring too many bombers relative to the others. This is language prevalent in the United States, but similar concerns were expressed in the Soviet Union. The bomber gap of the 1950s gave way to the missile gap of the late 50s and early 60s. Other concerns were over defensive measures and so forth. Weapon stocks peaked for the United States at around 35,000 warheads around 1965. While in the Soviet Union, stocks increased continuously until the end of the 1980s, when they had reached around 46,000 warheads. In terms of explosive power, the combined US and Soviet Union weapon stocks reached their apex in 1973, when together they had accumulated the equivalent of 20,000 megatons. 26,000 megatons of TNT equivalent. This was approximately 1.3 million Hiroshima bombs. In Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, Stanley Kubrick offered a ferocious satire of nuclear deterrence and of the logic of mutually assured destruction. In this 1964 movie, he drew considerable inspiration from the writings of nuclear strategists and weaved this into a dramatic scenario of an accidental nuclear war that had resulted from a rogue commander in the United States launching a nuclear attack at the Soviet Union, and the US president and his advisors trying throughout the film to call back the planes and prevent the retaliation that would come from the Soviet Union that would then, of course, trigger a Third World War. One of the key twists in the film is the discovery of the existence of a Doomsday Machine, a device constituted of a computer hooked up to a huge stock of thermonuclear bombs that would automatically detonate and shroud the Earth in deadly radiation if a nuclear attack by the adversary was detected. So at this moment, I would encourage you to pause the video and watch the brief excerpt from Dr. Strangelove. As Dr. Strangelove points out, the eponymous Dr. Strangelove, by taking the human out of the loop in the Doomsday Machine construct, deterrence was made all the more credible because there was no possibility of either a decapitation strike, the taking out of the decision makers. This was a major fear in the Cold War. What if the Soviets strike at the White House and kill the president and there's no one there to give an order? But it also meant there could be no failure of nerve. No one would hesitate because it would be simply an automatic execution of a threat, even a dramatic threat as collective nuclear suicide, which is what the Doomsday Machine entailed. Now, the Doomsday Machine, if it sounds completely fantastical, was something that was found in the writings of Herman Kahn. And indeed, there's evidence that the Soviet Union produced something akin to the Doomsday Machine, a command and control system called Dead Hand, that was intended to automate retaliation to a US attack. It's unclear what degree of automation was involved, the extent to which this system was activated or not, but there's very credible evidence of its existence, and indeed that it may in fact still be operational today in Russia. Now, the absurdity of the nuclear weapon, and by extension of the entire policy of mutually assured destruction, was not lost on all strategists. As I said, Herman Kahn wrote about the Doomsday Machine, but he didn't write of it as a machine that he endorsed. Rather, he used it to critique the existing US and NATO policy. He was critical of the fact that mutually assured destruction was really an all or nothing. Either deterrence succeeds and we have no war, or it fails and we have nuclear Armageddon. And Kahn argued that the logic of that was ultimately the Doomsday Machine. Now, what Kahn proceeded to do is to argue for limited nuclear war. That we could fight a war that would be short of mutual annihilation. In this regard, Kant was not on his own. Other theorists throughout the Cold War tried to produce plans for limited nuclear war. Bernard Brodie and William Kaufman advanced the idea of a counterforce strategy, which meant rather than sending nuclear weapons at Soviet cities, they would be sent only at Soviet offensive capabilities. And if you did that at the inception of a conflict, so for example, if the Soviets invaded Europe and you didn't want to go all the way to a full-blown nuclear war, what you would do is you would attack their offensive capabilities, their own nuclear weapons, their tanks, their armies, and in doing so, it was hoped, you would define the limits of the conflict. You would signal to the Russians, this is not a war of extermination, we have deliberately held back and only targeted your military sites or targets, and your response should be of a similar ilk. According to some plans, if an early strike took out most of the Russian capability, the Russians would be unable to destroy the US remaining nuclear stocks, and the US would then, if it needed to, knock off Russian cities one by one until surrender. And optimistically, this was estimated that this would probably only result in the death of 3 million Americans and 5 million Russians, so a much better outcome than full-blown nuclear war. One of the proponents of these kinds of views, as I said, was Hermann Kahn, who produced two major works in the 1960s. The first one called On Thermonuclear War in 1960, obviously a riff on Clausewitz's On War, gives you a sense of the ambition of the man. And the second book entitled Thinking About the Unthinkable in 1962. What, of course, Kahn means here is nuclear war, thinking nuclear war as both logical, palatable, and winnable. Kahn was keen to avoid what he called wargasm, by which he meant the failure of mutually assured destruction, an orgy of nuclear destruction. He advanced plans for gradated use of nuclear weapons. Again, a kind of idea that you would be able to have a tit-for-tat bargaining, that you could have different steps in the ladder of escalation, that you wouldn't, again, have to go all the way to complete annihilation. You could have limited nuclear war. Now, this wasn't to the liking of all American military men. The SAC general, Tommy Power, so the man who was responsible for delivering nuclear weapons, Tommy Power, the aptly named Tommy Power, harangued Kaufman in 1960 for proposing similar plans of limited war. "Why do you want us to restrain ourselves?" Power is reported to have said. "Restraint? Why are you so concerned with saving their lives? The whole idea is to kill the bastards. Look, at the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian, we win." To which Kaufman replied, "Well, you'd better make sure they're a man and a woman." But plans for limited war were never adopted, largely because the strategists advancing it were never able to persuade decision makers that once you initiated nuclear war, you would not inevitably lead to escalation. That if you crossed the threshold of nuclear war, you would eventually get to mutual annihilation. And so, despite the détente of the 1970s, the various steps towards arms controls between the Cold War protagonists through the SALT treaties, deterrence through the threat of mass annihilation remained the central policy essentially throughout the Cold War. And of course, this raises the question of whether, in fact, it did work. After all, there was no full-blown war during the Cold War. There were, of course, many major proxy wars, but nuclear war was avoided. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara has a less optimistic view. He, in narrating the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguably one of the greatest moments of danger in the Cold War, the closest to which the Soviet Union and the United States came to war, McNamara's recollection of those events was not that of deterrence working flawlessly. We came that close to nuclear war, he says. Rational individuals, Kennedy was rational, Khrushchev was rational, Castro was rational, rational individuals came that close to total destruction of their societies. And this danger exists today. In the end, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And in support of McNamara's contention, recent historical materials have come out that show that Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader who was at the center of this crisis since nuclear missiles were being installed in Cuba by the Soviet Union, Castro seemed to have been absolutely willing to engage in nuclear war and was reportedly furious when the Soviets withdrew the weapons. So it appears that Castro was willing to go to the brink and beyond, despite the fact that Cuba would have been annihilated had a nuclear war erupted around it. And so this gets at some of the limits of possible deterrence, that rationality on which deterrence is founded, since deterrence is intended to convey to individuals that it is not in their interests to pursue a given attack because they are presumably rationally weighing costs and benefits. Even this rationality, and perhaps this rationality is not constant, of course, does not ensure that war won't happen. And therefore, sometimes we may have to rest on blind luck. Others pointed out that it was a fundamental flaw in the deterrence plan that the United States had, even if we accept the rationalist premises of deterrence theory. Because the United States was guaranteeing Western Europe's security through its nuclear umbrella. It signaled to the Soviet Union, if you invade Europe, we will retaliate with nuclear weapons. We will go to nuclear war. But many objected that this was not really a credible threat. That if push came to shove, if the Soviet Union marched into Western Europe, the US resolve to go to nuclear war over Europe would be tested. Would the United States really bring about the destruction of its own society to save the Europeans? Some think that's doubtful. Certainly that was one of the arguments advanced by the French when they developed their independent nuclear capability, that ultimately they couldn't rest or rely on the American capability or even assurances.